things of that nature. And notice that if you are already a strong partisan, in other words, if you hold to a particular point of view very strongly, you will pretty much believe anything negative about the enemy. Because, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, Chapter 6 will discuss a psychological impediment to cogent reasoning that the author will call having partisan mindsets. If you get into a partisan mindset, where you literally think that anyone who disagrees with you is the enemy and less than you, more stupid than you, a low information voter, go on with a list of insults, it's no wonder you're likely going to believe that they believe something stupid. Now, my little side line here is, there are several signposts for detecting a straw man. One of the easy ones you may have seen in the homework exercises is, if a person is presenting her opponent's point of view, there's a good chance that she might do what? Misrepresent or distort. So in other words, if the person is not speaking for herself, there's a good chance that if the opponent is setting up her point of view, there's a good chance it might be a straw man. Now, my other signpost is this. If the position seems too absurd for any thoughtful person to hold, nobody probably actually does hold that point of view. In other words, it's probably a straw man. If it seems not to pass, what I would call a basic common sense test, that person probably doesn't actually hold that point of view. Now, what kind of issues are you likely to hear straw men on? And by the way, don't use these for your homework for Monday. You frequently hear them on political wedge issues. On so-called environmentalism, you might hear an opponent of environmentalism saying how stupid these greenies are, because they basically want to destroy civilization and put us all back to picking nuts and berries. Well, the problem is, there might be a handful of environmentalists who want to do that, but it's not what?
Majority?
Yeah, it's not the mainstream view. Most people who self-identify as environmentalists think that we need regulations because corporations cannot be trusted not to destroy the commons. Because the ideology of Milton Friedman, that was the name I was looking for last time, is that it is the duty of a corporation only to benefit its shareholders, not the stakeholders. That means everybody who's affected by it. He even argued that corporations have a duty to create as many externalities as possible. That basically means passing on your costs of doing business to other people than your shareholders. Shareholders make money, meanwhile, the populace gets to pick up the tab for environmental cleanup. That's oftentimes what it amounts to. I am not setting up a straw man here, incidentally. You can actually hear Milton Friedman saying this in his own words in interviews. He is no longer with us, though. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, by the way. But anyway, frequently environmentalists are misrepresented in this way as being crazy greenies who want to go back to picking nuts and berries. You might hear these kinds of issues on the abortion issue. And by the way, I have heard people who are anti-abortion basically calling their opponents a bunch of people who want to have as many babies killed as possible. That is a straw argument. I've also heard pro-choice people making the same kind of crazy extremist arguments about people who are pro-life. They couldn't care less about murdering people who are alive, but they want to save every last fetus from being killed. Well, guess what? There are some pro-life people who do hold that point of view, but it is not what? No. It is not the majority. And I think I've given another piece of advice. If you take the viewpoints of outliers of a particular group as the dominant argument for that point of view. That is one way that straw arguments are sometimes set up. Any questions here? Grant. Now, the reason I want to do this next one now, even though this is all out of order on the list, is because this next fallacy will frequently have a straw man embedded within it. The next one I want to discuss is what is called the either-or fallacy. It's also known as the false dilemma. You might also hear it called the black-white fallacy. You might hear it called false bifurcation. Same concept by many names. Now, you might see me use both of these words on a quiz or test. I'm just warning you right now. Sometimes I will call it an either-or fallacy, sometimes a false dilemma. Now, to explain what a false dilemma is, it perhaps pays to know what the concept of a dilemma means. The root is die. Die is a prefix that means what? It means two, not peace or victory. Die means two. So when we have a dilemma argument, we have something being argued in such a way that there are only two when we have a dilemma, someone has set up an argument as if there are only two possible positions, two possible scenarios, two possible options. And by the way, it might look like this logically. Now you'll notice that looks like a symbolized deductive construction. We say P or Q. Now can you take a guess when our dilemma happens to be a false dilemma? This will be obvious.
When both of them are the right answer?
Yeah. It's whenever somebody sets up an argument in such a way where they claim there's only two possible options or scenarios, when there in fact are what? When there are in fact more options than the arguer posits. In other words, if in reality it was P or Q or R, that would mean we have omitted some other possibilities. Now notice whenever you set up a false dilemma, folks, what you basically do is you force your audience into taking one of two positions. Can you take a guess what the next move typically is in a false dilemma argument? Yeah. You'll say P or Q, but you'll say the viewpoint of P is like really stupid, and then whatever stupidity you want to adduce to it. And then take a guess what your conclusion then is.
You're not an idiot.
Yeah.
Q.
Therefore, it must be Q. Now you'll notice this is a deductively valid structure. What was it called? This was a disjunctive syllogism. So I mean, deductively speaking, dilemma arguments done this way, as disjunctive syllogism, are not invalid. The problem is, when the premises put in are what? That answer is questionable. When this premise is false, when there's actually more options, you have committed a false dilemma. Now there's one more way that this can also be a false dilemma. If neither of these options are genuine options. In other words, let's say I'm setting up a dilemma argument, and Q is my point of view. So I intentionally set up P as a what? As a lesser or weakened version of the other view. In other words, I set up a what? I set up one of the two options as a straw man. Well, if the other one sounds completely moronic, of course I'm going to be kind of forcing you to go along with me, unless you what? Unless you say, hey, wait a minute, you misrepresented your opponent's position. And by the way, what about these other options that you haven't even considered? Now, this is the sort of scenario that we have for the false dilemma argument. And I also explained why it's fallacious. Now, folks, there are signposts for, I won't say false dilemma arguments, but dilemma arguments. You better not identify a practice exercise as a false dilemma if there is no blank being argued. No either-or scenario being set up. In other words, if within the body of that argument, the arguer is setting up some kind of scenario in which there are only two options, that might be your best bet, is to consider, well, are the two options that this person's presenting likely plausible ones? Now, you'll notice we have plenty of either-or dilemmas on plenty of political issues. And perhaps the false dilemma argument is almost unnatural for our political system, or at least the way our political system is discussed. Does anyone know why? The answer will be obvious. Hoover.
Can you restate that question?
Yeah. Why is it that our political system, or at least the way our political system is discussed, would you expect these false dilemmas to be fairly commonplace?
Because we're really based off of just the two parties.
Yeah, she nailed it. You got to take the mainstream Dems view or the mainstream Republican view. And they are treated as if they are monolithic. That is, that there's no disagreement within each of the parties. And it turns out that both of these political parties, if we studied it, we would find out that there's actually a lot of diversity within each of the political parties. This is why, sorry, my politics are showing. This is why some of us think we would be better off with some kind of system where we had maybe 6 political parties, or I should say 6 viable political parties. Unfortunately, you know, it's a circular sort of thing. Well, why should we support you if you can't win? Well, if you don't support us, we can't win. Of course we can't win. And it's sort of what keeps what we've got going, and some of us think what we've got is a junker. But yeah, it's sort of no wonder. Say, well, you've got the Democrats' health care proposal or the Republicans' health care proposal. Well, what about the one that's not on the table? In other words, the one on the table, simply because it's not mainstream put out there, doesn't mean it's not an alternative. Now, you'll probably notice that on a lot of political wedge issues, you're likely to see these two. Next. Folks, this is probably a fallacy name that you have heard before. I would suggest you probably heard "to beg the question" before, even if you only have a vague idea of what it means. Now, there's a version of the begging the question fallacy that's also called this. It's also called the fallacy of circular reasoning. Now, some commentators will suggest there's like a subtle difference between these two, but we won't be treating it that way. Now, when we beg the question, what we do is we begin with a premise. A premise that almost always requires what? That requires more clarification and or justification. Our next step is, instead of explaining or justifying our premise, guess what we do? Next, typically what we do is we conclude with a version of the premise that is merely restated as a conclusion. So in effect, we haven't really argued anything. We've merely made a premise, and then we've restated that premise in another way as if it were its own conclusion. Now, begging the question is often something people miss, and this is because we are oftentimes not to look deeply into the things that we're hearing or reading. And I'll give you an easy example. This is a commonly heard argument. How do I know that abortion is immoral? Because it's unnatural, and therefore it's wrong. Guess what question is begged here? You'll notice that saying that something is unnatural is very close to what a natural law type person would call immoral. So you basically really substituted what? Same concept for a same concept. Different word, but nothing has really been substantially argued. This argument fails because the question is begged, because we need a further explanation of why something being unnatural makes it immoral. In other words, the real meat of the argument has been omitted. The premise has merely been restated as if it was self-evident proof of itself, when it's not. Give you another one. I'll read it in a minute. Now, admittedly, this is sort of a crude, watered-down version of an argument I've heard some believers make. How do I know that God's perfect? Well, because the Bible says so. And God says that the Bible is infallible. Well, you notice that's all predicated on what? Yeah. In other words, you kind of assume from the get-go the truth of the text. So your proof turns out to be circular. What we do here is we simply argue in a circle here, where the very starting assumption actually requires further conversation. Now, we're almost out of these. Because remember, I already ruled out questionable premise here, because I said it was too vague. Now, here's another one that you're not likely to see on a quiz or test, at least not now, and I'll explain to you why. How many of you recall reading about the fallacy of suppressed evidence? Good, good. Now, you may have read the definition of suppressed evidence, and it itself turns out to break a cardinal rule of definition. That's one of my problems with it. Does anyone know what I mean by a cardinal rule of defining something? What aren't you supposed to do in your definition?
Use the word to explain it.
Yeah. One ought not to appeal to the same darn word that you're trying to explain. Because if somebody doesn't already understand the concept, you're not going to be any help to them in explaining it. That turns out to be a sort of circular way of defining things. But yeah, the author ends up using the phrase suppressed in it. So I'm going to try to define it in a way that is not quite so circular. Suppressed evidence occurs in an argument when we accept a conclusion based upon relevant supporting evidence while contrary evidence has been omitted. Now there's two ways of omitting evidence from an argument. Of course they're what? Unintentional and what? And intentional. Now you'll notice that if somebody's trying to take a position and she's trying to find supporting reasons for it, she might conveniently grab whatever reasons are ready to hand. And I'll give you a direct example. And this is a word that will come up later. If you're trying to prove a position, take a guess what is not a good, I should say, a good critical way of doing it. I'll give you the example, and I don't think my office mate will care. My office mate, soon to be X, she has this phrase. She goes, "I'm a great Googler." And let me translate what a good Googler means. It means whatever biased point of view she happens to believe, she can find supporting evidence for it online. Now folks, why is this not a good way of finding confirming evidence?
It's more an affirmation than evidence.
Yeah. In other words, if you were just going out and looking for evidence that would seem to support your position, you might be overlooking the more crucial pieces of evidence that might go against your position. So if you really want to get to the quote-unquote truth, what you should be doing is surveying a wide array of information, not just honing in on what would seem to support your point of view. That commits the fallacy that's not mentioned in our text, but you've probably heard of it in like a psych class or whatever. If you've heard of confirmation bias, this refers to our psychological tendency that if we hold a particular point of view, that we will only tend to see those kind of things that will support our point of view. And we tend to have psychological tendencies not to see clearly those things that might stand against our point of view. So this is kind of our psychological tendencies working against us. You see, we might commit suppressed evidence that way, perhaps not even knowing that we're doing it. And by the way, the ignorant might also commit suppressed evidence unintentionally. In other words, if you don't know a whole lot about a particular subject, it's no wonder you might accept a particular conclusion based upon some shreds of relevant evidence without seeing the whole picture. Now, one of the reasons why I am not going to be emphasizing this fallacy too much is, well, there's actually two reasons. Suppressed evidence is actually very difficult to detect unless you what? Yeah, unless you already know something about the topic at hand. It's very difficult to determine whether or not there's relevant evidence left out or not. And I don't want to presuppose that you folks are experts on everything. I think that would be unfair. Now there's a second reason why I'm not going to overemphasize this one. And this is because what the authors here is calling suppressed evidence for our purposes will oftentimes show up in other kinds of fallacies that we will see in later chapters. For example, suppressed evidence will oftentimes be done on the grounds of some kind of supporting statistics. But the question is, what if the supporting statistics are unrepresentative or too small? Well, we'll be talking about those two forms of statistical bias in Chapter 5. So much of what the author will call suppressed evidence here will be explained more concretely elsewhere. So I'm not going to be making a big deal out of suppressed evidence. I think this next one is my last one, if I'm correct. This one I'm also not going to be making a big deal out of. How many of you saw tokenism in the text? Now, one of the reasons I don't like well, there's two reasons I don't like it. Number one is, it's not one of those things that makes most traditional fallacy lists anyway. Because it's more of a psychological error than a logical error from where I'm standing. Now the second reason is the author does what again with this fallacy that was done with suppressed evidence? Uses the word token gesture in order to define tokenism. Well, if you don't know what a token gesture is, that definition's not going to do you much good. Now, what did some of you take to be tokenism, or how might you explain the idea of tokenism? Now, we know what a token is. A token refers to something that it's something that stands in for something else. And I'll give you an example you won't have to know for the test. Money is a token. Money symbolizes economic value. Money symbolizes it. That's why money is a form of a token. Now you notice if it's not real money, in many cases we actually do call it a token. You know, if you're at the arcade or whatever and you have to, do people still do that? Yeah, at the arcade we used to call them tokens. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, offer someone like a gesture, like, for the homework, because, like, all these famous writers started out as like you with like your first play or like poem. So it's like prompting them like they can be successful like these people, they just have to start out.
That's an innovative way of looking at that problem. And we'll come back to that in a minute. We probably won't have time for it much today. But you hear what Mr. Castle was talking about. If we give a person a token, we like give them something that is we present them with something that is actually inauthentic. But our aim is that we hope that they'll think it's what? Token gestures happen in political circles all of the time. And I'll give you a relatively old example. And there's nothing wrong with old examples if they fit. And this is going back in my own political archives, if you will. Some of you might be too young, I know many of you are too young to remember when Tom Ridge was Pennsylvania's two-term governor. Many of you probably remember him more as what? Because of your age. Yeah, the security czar, the director of Homeland Security and so forth. But he was Pennsylvania's two-term governor prior to that. He gave, I guess what I would call it, a version of an October surprise before his second re-election bid. It was indeed a token gesture. Pennsylvanians had been crying out for property tax reform for at least 25 years.